Can we approach?
Yeah, I said yes.
Oh, I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Thank you.
Yes, sir, no problem.
So I think I was saying, have you had an opportunity to review the video surveillance on the flash drive?
Yes.
Does that fairly and accurately depict the Sunset Lakes guard gate, specifically the area covering that 40th Street entrance? Your Honor, at this time, the state moves into evidence that was pre-marked. It states WW as the state's next numbered exhibit.
Is there any objection?
No.
It be admitted.
And permission to publish?
Mrs. Martin, yes, ma'am, you may publish.
States WW, we mark states 47.
I'm sorry. Can you all see the screen? Why don't you have a seat up front here? How about that?
Yeah.
All right?
Where?
Right up the front row.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. Your Honor, nothing further for this witness.
Thank you. Is there any cross-examination?
One question. May I do it from here, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Could you tell in that video how many people were in that vehicle that we just played?
So the driver, I can't say.
So you don't know if there were 4 or 5 people in that car, correct?
Correct.
Thank you very much.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Is this witness excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you very much. You may step down. You're excused.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Counsel, want to call your next witness?
George Bella.
Mr. Bello, please. Okay, raise your right hand and be sworn.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm your testimony you shall give in this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Can you state your full legal name for the record?
My name is George Bello.
Please spell your first and last name for the court reporter.
It's Georgebello.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Please have a seat.
Thank you.
Bellow, that microphone will adjust up and down, but not back and forth.
Okay, no problem.
With your permission, Your Honor?
You ready, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Bello. How are you today?
Good morning. I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Very well, thank you for asking. Could you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury where you work?
I'm the Crime Lab Unit Manager in the Fireman Tool Mark Unit for Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab.
What does that mean?
Basically, it means that I examine known and unknown tool marks to determine whether or not they came from a common source, along with, of course, because I'm a manager, I manage and maintain the standard operating procedures as well as training for any new members of the lab.
How long have you been the manager at the Broward Sheriff's Office Fire and Arms and Tool Mark Section?
I've been the manager there for about 6.5 years.
Prior to being the manager for in the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab, where else have you worked?
I was a criminalist in the Fireman Tool Mark Unit for Miami-Dade Police Department Crime Lab.
And how long were you a criminalist there?
Approximately 7 years.
How long in total have you been working with firearms in this discipline?
So in the discipline, I've been for a total of about 13.5 years.
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what type of background and education you have?
I have a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology, which I received from Florida International University.
And when did you graduate from Florida International University?
Good question. I think it was probably about 2009, 2010, somewhere around there.
July of 2009, sound correct?
Yeah,
Would that be reflected on your CV?
yes.
If you need to refer to that at any point, please let me know.
Okay, will do.
Have you memorized every single training you've ever taken, date and time?
No.
Okay.
No, certainly not.
So if you could tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, after you graduated in 2009 with your Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology, what was the next steps you took in training and education specific to your current employment?
So training in the Fireman Tool Mark discipline typically primarily occurs at labs. It's usually on-the-job training. The main reason for that is universities are gun-free zones, and so it would be a very difficult task to try to get an education in firearms on a university campus. So the training program at Miami-Dade is a 2-year training program. It's the same in Broward Sheriff's Office. It revolves around a training manual, and that manual is comprised of several different modules that we have to complete. Some of the modules in that training manual include history of firearms design, modern firearm design, history of ammunition development, orientation, instrumentation, ethics, firearms comparisons, tool mark comparisons, distance determinations, serial number restoration, and many other modules. Learning throughout that program is measured by giving technical presentations as well as writing technical papers. I also will take written examinations, oral exams, culminating eventually in a competency test to determine whether or not I can physically do the work, and then a mock trial as well as testimony training. In addition to that in-house training, I also receive training outside the laboratory in order to fulfill my job duties. Some of the different trainings I received included training in factory tours and armorers courses. And factory tours are really important for firearms examiners because they allow us to see how the integral parts of a firearm are made. So those are the parts that leave individual and identifiable marks on casings and projectiles. So some of those parts that we can observe being made are the barrel, firing pins, extractors, ejectors, magazines, magazine lips. And so we can see how all of those parts are manufactured at different manufacturers and see how the individual marks are imparted onto the tools themselves. And then the armorers courses work hand in hand with that in that they show us how all of those parts work together inside of an actual firearm. During the armorers course, we'll strip down the firearm down to its screws and base components and then reassemble it and do that several times. In that process, we can see how those parts work together to leave the marks on casings and projectiles. So the factory tours show us how the marks go from the manufacturer onto the guns, and then the armor's courses can show us how the guns leave the marks on the casings and projectiles.
Okay, that's a lot of information, so let's slow
Yeah.
down and come back a little bit. Okay, so you talked about touring various gun manufacturers.
Yes.
Approximately how many times have you done that in the course of your employment as a firearms tool market manufacturer?
I believe I've toured somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to, somewhere between 12 and 15 manufacturers.
Is this a visitor's tour, or is this a hands-on technical evaluation?
No, it's a technical tour. Firearms manufacturers are very particular, so they don't let just anybody, if you're not involved with law enforcement, specifically really firearms examiners, they don't let you through the door to take a tour. And so typically the ones that are giving the tour are like chief of engineering or something like that, where they know how each of those components are being made and where they're being made. And then because these factories are fairly large, and so when you're touring them, I don't necessarily need to see assembly, I don't necessarily need to see when they're manufacturing a slide. Those parts that don't make marks on cases and projectiles are really not important for us. And so they know, because we're in communication with them, the parts that we need to see manufactured and the information that we ask them, they have to be able to know what the answers are as well. So just somebody who's hired to operate a machine may not know some of the details that I'm going to ask. So it is a very specific tour.
So on the armorer's course, are those specific to each individual brand or make and model of firearm?
Yes, so specific to really the make and model of the firearm. So the armorer's courses, like let's say the Glock armorer's course, will teach you how to disassemble, reassemble Glock pistols. They also teach you how to fix Glock pistols. So that's kind of an added component for us. If we receive a firearm that is broken, we know how to put it back together because we've been to these armorer's courses. But they are specific. So if you take a Smith & Wesson armorer's course, Smith & Wesson makes a lot of different firearms. They don't just make pistols, they make revolvers, they make rifles, and so they have revolver armorer's courses, they have pistol armorer's courses, they have rifle armorer's courses. And so in order to be an armorer in each of those, you would have to take an armorer's course for each of those categories.
In terms of the number of armorer's courses you've taken, can you please give an approximate number to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury?
It's probably in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 armorer's courses.
On your daily, day-to-day job,
Mhm.
how many times do you handle a firearm?
Every day. Pretty much every day that I come into the office, I handle a firearm of some sort or another.
And is it one a day?
It can vary. So sometimes if a case has enough fired evidence, I may shoot one firearm for that particular case and then make comparisons. But if it's a day where I'm coming in and just test firing firearms, I might test fire anywhere between 75 and 100 in that particular day. So it kind of varies by the task that I'm performing any given day. So it'll be anywhere from 1 to, say, 100.
In a single day for firearms?
Yes.
And is that for the entirety of the 13 and a half years you've worked in firearms?
Yes, minus the 2 years of training. So approximately 11 and a half years of handling a firearm every day.
In terms of the services that you can provide and do at the lab, is there a service called a distance or range of fire determination?
Yes.
Is that something that you've had training and experience in?
Yes.
Could you please tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury your training that you have in range of fire or distance determination?
So the distance determination training is primarily in-house because it's comprised of several different parts of firearms examiner training. So in order to perform distance determinations, typically we're going to need a firearm and some kind of fired evidence tying evidence to the firearm or tying the firearm to the scene. The reason for that is that distance determination, when chemically processed, is a destructive examination that can only be done one time. So if I process, let's say a sweater or a shirt for distance determination, I can only do that one time. And so we want to make sure that when we're doing it with the firearm that was found at the scene, because if not, then we're applying so many variables that we can't account for when giving a distance. And so The training is really based off of the FBI, I think it's FBI gunpowder, gunshot residue training course. And it's essentially a compilation of articles that we go through and read them. We practice making the chemicals that are required for making the test paper, the chemicals that are required for making all of the spray solutions that we would use to chemically process the garments, as well as training in using infrared microscopy and different light microscopy to try to see gunpowder on different pattern of clothing. Once we've completed that training, it culminates, of course, in doing 10 practice exercises, and then eventually a competency test to make sure that we can arrive at a known answer that an instructor gave.
Okay, so Mr. Bello, to go back, you said that you can do chemical testing. You mentioned like a sweater,
Yes,
and you said it's destructive.
Yes.
What does that mean?
so the reaction that we're looking for when we do distance determination is a chromophoric reaction, so it's a color reaction. Burnt gunpowder reacts, or the nitrites in burnt gunpowder react with the chemicals that we're using to give an orange reaction. That reaction will only happen that one time. So if I processed it again, it wouldn't react again because those chemicals are no longer present.
So, Mr. Bello, can you do that on a human body?
No, you cannot chemically process a human body. Right.
And how long has the Broward Sheriff's Office lab been doing this process of the chemical determination of distance determination?
I believe it's been done since its induction, so I believe somewhere in the late 60s is when they started doing it.
And specifically at the Broward Sheriff's Office, when did you guys onboard this procedure?
So we've been doing it, at least since I've been there, we've been able to do it. It did have a brief hiatus. When I was hired, the fire and tool mark unit was shut down because all of its previous examiners had retired or left. And so we had to shut down for about a year. And then when we started doing examinations again, we started offering the full range of examinations.
And when you say you had to shut down for a year, why is that?
We didn't have anybody to actually do the work. So we could have received the evidence, but it would have sat around for that entire time frame because nobody could do the work.
You were there, why couldn't you do the work?
Well, I was hired afterwards. Yeah, so I was hired after the examiners had left. And anytime you hire somebody, even if they're trained from another laboratory, they have to be onboarded. So that onboarding process does include doing casework. So any casework that I was authorized to do before in Miami-Dade, I had to redo. So the quality assurance manager and the lab director gave me tests when I was onboarded, and I had to pass the test, so I had to come to the known conclusions that another examiner already knew the answer was, in order to be able to do the same examination at Broward Sheriff's Office.
Okay, so you were certified to do the examinations in Dade County.
Authorized, so I was authorized by Miami-Dade to do that at Miami-Dade County, yes.
And that authorization, how long does it last for?
Typically it's for my employment unless there's some kind of lapse. So if part of the authorization or part of the requirement for authorization is competency testing. And so if there's a lapse, proficiency testing. If there's a lapse in my proficiency testing and I don't complete casework in that particular field, then I wouldn't be authorized by the laboratory to do that work anymore.
Is there a difference between authorization and being certified in the field of firearms tool marks examiners?
Yes, so by definition, laboratories can authorize you to do work. They don't certify you to do work. A certification implies that there's a third party, right? Another body outside of your employer that's giving you some kind of standardized test. And so there is certification in distance determination, in firearms comparison analysis, and tool marks that's offered by the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners. So that would be the certification. It's a test that was made by experts to be challenging, and so when you pass that, you've passed a standard test that everyone who's certified in that field passed. Authorizations are subjective in that they're designed and implemented by individual laboratories. So that's saying, an authorization is saying you can do that test in that laboratory. So if you have an authorization, like I have an authorization for Broward Sheriff's Office, it doesn't mean that I can go to Chicago and do what I do in Chicago. If I'm certified, that means that I've met at least the base knowledge and practical knowledge to be able to do the examination as tested by an outside agency.
So, Mr. Bello, if you go and complete an armorer's course at Sig Sauer, at Taurus, at Glock, are they certifying you that you are an expert in their firearms?
They're saying you're an armorer in their firearms, so once you've completed an armorer's course, let's say for Glock, then they give you a certificate saying that you're a Glock armorer. That certificate's typically valid for anywhere between 3 and 5 years, depending on the manufacturer. But once that time lapses, then Glock will no longer consider you an armorer for their firearm. And at that point, you'd have to go back and take another armorer's course for Glock to then be updated with all of the information, get a new certificate, and then you would be a Glock armorer again.
Okay, and so Mr. Belli, you talked about the Association of Firearms and Tool Marks Examiners.
Mhm.
Are you certified by that organization?
I am.
How long have you been certified by them?
I believe I was first certified in 2015, so I guess 7 years, more or less, 7 or 8 years.
Has that been continual since 2015?
Yes,
Do you have to take continuing education to maintain that certification?
yes. So the original certification is a test, so you take a written examination as well as a practical examination, and you have to pass, I believe the written examination you have to pass with an 80% score, and then the practical exam is essentially 100% because you can't give a wrong answer, and so you have to have 100% on the practical. And then to maintain that certification, you have to attend training or give training, so a combination thereof, and that is to a minimum of 100 hours every 5 years.
And Mr. Belli, do you teach in the area of firearms and tool marks?
I do. I give workshops, and I also obviously train any examiners that are new examiners in the field of firearm tool mark examiners.
Have you testified as an expert in court before?
Yes.
How many times?
Approximately, it's probably in the neighborhood of in the low 70s right now.
What jurisdictions have you testified in?
So I've testified in federal and state courts for Miami-Dade and Broward counties.
And what specific areas of expertise have you opined on?
So I've been allowed to opine on firearms, firearm examination and comparison, tool mark examination and comparison, serial number restoration, and muzzle target distance determination.
And I'd offer defense an opportunity for voir dire and experts qualifications. So, Mr. Bello, let's start and talk about what is the difference between ballistics and firearms.
So yeah, it's a commonly, I guess, misused phrase. I don't really work with what people would refer to as ballistics. So ballistics, as commonly used, is really speaking about external ballistics, and that's what happens to a projectile in flight. So from the time it leaves the barrel to the time it impacts a target. The area of ballistics that I do work in is internal ballistics and terminal ballistics. So in that area, that would be more synonymous with firearm examination, in that internal ballistics is what happens to a projectile and casing inside of a firearm, and then the terminal ballistics is what happens to that projectile after impacting an object.
So, terminal, like airport terminal?
Terminal's final, so the final destination, final endpoint of the projectile.
With regards to the internal ballistics, explain what causes there to be in what is internal ballistics.
Sure, so like the mechanics of discharging?
Please.
So the mechanics of discharging a firearm essentially is there's a firing sequence that occurs. Typically that firing sequence involves loading the firearm, usually with a magazine and semi-automatic firearms. The firearm can then be, the slide of the firearm would then be manually dropped. At that point, a live cartridge is going to be picked up from the magazine and inserted into the chamber of the firearm. Once the firearm is in that state, it's ready to fire. I mean, barring any manual safeties or something that's preventing it from firing, the firearm is loaded and ready to be fired. So with most modern firearms, at that point, you could pull the trigger. The trigger will release the hammer or the striker, which will detonate the firing pin. Detonate the primer. The primer of a cartridge is what holds a small explosive that ignites the powder inside the cartridge. That powder then expands through combustion and pushes a projectile through the barrel, and then at the same time, it will push the cartridge case rearward into the firearm itself. That rearward force is what causes the firearm to cycle. So at that point, the casing will be extracted and ejected, typically to the right and rear of where someone will be standing who's discharging the firearm. And then the cycle at that point starts all over again. So the slide comes forward, picking up another live cartridge, and you can then pull the firing of the hand. Sorry,
Okay, lots of
the
definitions,
trigger.
big words that are not necessarily common in everyday
Sure.
life, so let's go back a little bit. A live cartridge,
Mhm.
what is that?
I have a demonstrative I can show the jury.
Please, depends how you want to see it.
No,
Okay, so if you could explain what is a live cartridge?
May I approach the jury to show them?
Please stand up.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is a demonstrative exhibit, it's not in evidence.
oh,
Yeah, it's not a live cartridge or anything, it's just plastic. So, a live cartridge is essentially what you see here. So it's a projectile or a bullet, a cartridge case, the primer, and then inside is where the powder itself is housed. So if you can see at the bottom of the cartridge case, there's a hole. That's called the flash hole. So when the primer is struck by the firing pin, the force is what causes that powder to ignite. So the explosion that's inside of the primer is going to come through that flash hole and into the main body of the cartridge case, igniting the powder. When that powder is lit, the projectile leaves the cartridge, entering the barrel of the firearm, and then the cartridge travels rearward and exits the firearm in a semi-automatic firearm. The marks that you see on now a fired projectile are the marks that can be imparted by rifling. So by the rifling in a barrel, those are the raised areas of the barrel that impart spin on a projectile. That's their whole purpose, is to actually impart spin on the projectile. The spin stabilizes the projectile in flight, so it makes it more accurate for the shooters. There's different types of rifling, but they all leave some kind of mark or another on projectiles. The cartridge cases will receive several different marks. So the mark that's in the center is the firing pin impression. The marks that are around it, in this case, looks almost like a rectangle. That's the firing pin aperture impression. And then the parallel striations that you can see, that's from the breech face. There are also this little triangular mark. That's the ejector mark. And then it can receive an extractor mark, which is this kind of striated scratches that you see there. And that's from, all of those parts are from the firing of this cartridge.
Okay, well, again, a lot of terms and
Lot of
things that
terms.
people
Yeah.
don't deal with on a regular basis. Let's start with, and help make sure it's clear and defined,
Sure.
what the parts of a firearm are.
Okay.
Are there different classes of firearms?
There are several different classes of firearms. So for handguns, the most common classes of firearms are revolvers and pistols, or semi-automatic pistols.
And can you tell the jury, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the difference between what is a revolver and a semi-automatic?
So the main difference between a revolver and a semi-automatic firearm is that a revolver will have a set of chambers, and that's where these live cartridges are loaded. And then upon firing, the firearm will cycle itself, rotating that cylinder, but the cartridges do not eject. Right? The cartridges in a revolver have to be manually ejected. So they won't typically leave fired casings at a crime scene. Whereas semi-automatic firearms will automatically extract and eject fire casing every time that you pull the trigger.
So you're going to approach.
Okay.
I have a demonstrative fake firearm. Would you be so kind as to double check and
Sure.
make sure on that?
Again, ladies and gentlemen, just remember with the demonstratives, they're not in evidence. They're to assist the witness in explaining or illustrating his testimony. Help him explain it, but the evidence is the testimony of the witness. These demonstratives, unless they are later received in evidence, do not go back to the jury room during deliberations.
Is the item that you have in front of you a replica or plastic firearm?
Yes.
Does it shoot any projectiles?
No, it doesn't have a barrel or any, you can see that the barrel itself is plugged, so there's nothing that could possibly come out of this firearm.
Does it have a trigger that can be pulled?
No, it does not.
Okay. Does it have a slide or a magazine that can be moved?
It has a magazine that can be extracted, but the slide cannot be moved. The hammer cannot be cocked. So there's no, in this particular design, the only moving part is the magazine release, which ejects the plastic magazine.
Okay, so can you now use that, and if I can have the witness step down so we can put it on the screen to make it easy for the jurors to see? Mr. Bello, if you would be so kind. And so we have the green screen there to the right. If you could now slowly, in terms of describing the areas on a typical semi-automatic firearm.
Sure. So in this particular design, semi-automatic firearm, the area that you pull to fire is the trigger. That's this plastic area right here. This particular firearm has a manual safety. That's this device here. It's ambidextrous, so it should have its equal partner here. So what that means is that whether you're left-handed or right-handed, you can shoot it either way and activate the safety or deactivate the safety. On this side of the firearm, you can see that there's a slide catch. That's what this part of the firearm
What does
is.
the slide catch do?
It catches the slide. In firearms, you'll notice that our terminology is very self-explanatory. We like to keep it simple. And so this part here is the slide. That's the part that will travel rearward and extract a casing from this area here. That is the chamber. And on its rearward travel, it'll pick up a casing from that chamber, extracting and ejecting it. When it's empty, there's a spring inside the magazine that pushes this slide up automatically, and it'll catch the slide. That just lets the person who's shooting know the firearm is empty. You can insert another magazine and start to shoot again. And then this portion here is the barrel. In this case, it's an exposed barrel. Not every firearm has an exposed barrel, so sometimes the slide covers this area as well. And then this is the muzzle end of the barrel. So this is the portion of the barrel where the projectile itself travels out of. And I guess just to clarify also, the projectile is not the only thing that comes out of the barrel of a firearm. There are byproducts of discharge. And so,
We'll get back to that in a second. So can you demonstrate and show the ladies and gentlemen of the jury about how you would insert a standard magazine using that demonstrative?
sure. So in this particular firearm, you would just insert the magazine with the feed ramp of the magazine facing that direction. You just insert it into the well until it clicks in place. And at that point, slide up a little more. The magazine will sit flush with the bottom of the firearm, and the magazine is inserted. In regular function, at this point, typically the slide is to the rear of the firearm, and you would pull it back, and that would automatically release it to move forward and pick up a live cartridge and be in battery, which essentially just means that it's loaded and ready to fire.
Okay, so you discussed rifling.
Yes.
Where on this gun does the rifling come from?
So the rifling is from the barrel, so it's from this portion here. The chamber of this firearm ends right around here, and so from that portion forward is where the rifling will be present on the barrel of the firearm.
And explain what is rifling.
So rifling are raised portions of the inside of the barrel, which are designed to impart spin to the projectile, stabilizing the projectile in flight, and making the firearm itself more accurate.
Are those markings, the high and low points, standard in different firearms?
Yes, so there are characteristics that manufacturers will place on firearms. One of them is the width and number and direction of twist. So the width of land impressions, so how wide each of those marks is inside the barrel, is standardized, as well as the number, so whether it's 6 or 5, 3 or whatever that number might be, and the direction they twist the projectile in, so whether they twist right or left, are all purposely put in by the manufacturer.
Do different manufacturers have trademarked or patented rifling patterns?
They do. So, like Glock has Glock and Smith & Wesson are famously involved for, I guess Smith & Wesson tried to make a replica of what Glock has years ago, and Glock sued them, and they won the lawsuit, so Smith & Wesson had to immediately stop manufacturing the firearm the way they were manufacturing it. And it really came down to some of those class characteristics that we were talking about, so the marks that were inside the firearm. Not really how it looked, so the firearm still looks the same as a Glock, but the inside markings are different than Glock, and they had to make them different because of the lawsuit.
So with regard, you said class characteristics,
Mhm.
that's the type of firearm. How would you say that's different from individual characteristics of a specific firearm?
So class characteristics are those characteristics that are put in place by the firearm manufacturer on purpose. They know they're putting them in there, they chose to put them in there. So that's the caliber, the shape of the firing pin, the shape of the firing pin aperture, the number of lands and grooves in a barrel, the direction of the twist. Those are all on purpose. They decided those numbers, and that's what they are making them all with. So every Taurus pistol, which this is basically a replica of, is a Taurus PT92. So every Taurus pistol will have 6 land impressions. They all twist to the right. They all have a hemispherical firing pin. They all have a circular firing pin aperture. Now, the individual marks are the marks that the tooling puts in incidental to manufacture. So basically, they're accidental marks. Manufacturer doesn't know they're being imparted. They don't mean for them to be imparted. They just happen by the mechanical action of making the parts. So the cutting tools or the forming tools that are used to make the barrel, to make the slide, to make the aperture, all leave marks, which are microscopic in nature, on these different parts.
So I'll stop sliding for you. And so before I have you resume your seat, could you show where would the ejector marks be made on this particular?
So I can't open the firearm, and that's where the ejector would be, but if, looking at it from this angle, the extractor is on this side of the firearm. It's a hook that's put in place right here in the slide, and then the ejector is on the opposite side. So if you could think of opposing forces, the hook has to grab the casing and pull it out. The ejector has to push the casing from the opposite side of the extractor and push it out of the firearm. So the ejector is typically placed in here, attached to the slide itself, or attached to the frame of the firearm, but protruding through the slide.
And so, Mr. Ballard, if you'd be so kind as to resume your seat.
Can we take the front back?
You can, yes, that would be good. Okay, so still a lot of definitions. I want to make sure we understand. You talked about lands,
Yes.
L-A-N-D-S. What is a land?
So a land inside of the barrel of a firearm is the raised area. So that's the actual area that's left inside of the firearm that impacts the projectiles. So that's the area that's going to leave those scratches that I had showed you earlier. The opposing areas are the grooves. So in cutting methods, the grooves are the raised areas on the projectile, and they're the lower areas on the firearm. So these are the areas that typically are cut away by another tool inside of the barrel. Usually when we're looking at projectiles, examiners look at the land impressed areas, not as much the groove impressed areas, only because we have found some repetition in the groove areas from different manufacturing methods. And so in order to avoid any possible confusion as to whether or not it came from a particular firearm, we look at areas we know are individual, which are the land impressed areas.
So in that, you're just talking about the lands on the projectiles.
Correct.
Is there any lands and grooves on the casings?
No, there are no lands and grooves on casings.
Is there a database or some sort of literature that tells you which manufacturers use 7 lands or which use 3?
Yes, so the FBI years ago compiled a database that they call the the gun reference database. And so basically that database has a list of manufacturers and what their specific numbers would be as far as direction of twist, number of lands and grooves, and the width of the landing groove. And so with the width, whenever we try to use that database, we try to add a little bit more to the width of the land impressions that we're measuring, only so that it becomes a more comprehensive list than a more restrictive list. So if we're gonna make an error, we wanna make sure we're more inclusive in this error than exclusive.
Okay. So you also talked about firing pins. Is there just one type of firing pin?
No, there are several different types and shapes of firing pins. So your typical firing pins that you're going to observe in firearms are hemispherical. I'd say that's the majority of them that we're going to see. Hemispherical just means kind of rounded in nature as far as the tip of the firing pin. But they also have firing pins that are elliptical in shape. A lot of examiners call them Glock shape because Glock was one of the first manufacturers to use this elliptical shape of the firing pin. There's also rectangular firing pins, although not super common, or certainly they were more common in the 80s and 90s than they are today. But they still are some manufacturers that use rectangular or square firing pins. And then you have rim-fire firing pins, which can be square, rectangular, or circular as well. And so there are different categories of firing pins, absolutely.
When you talk about the firing pin, is the front of it flat, or is there a difference in the geometry of the front of the firing pin?
So the tip of the firing pin, which is typically what we're going to be examining, are different geometries. So that's that shape that I was referencing. It can either be hemispherical, which has that almost like, you know, if you think about a globe, it has that rounded shape to it. That's essentially the type of shape that we're looking at in a hemispherical firing pin. Elliptical is an ellipse, so it's an area where the very tip is pointed, but the edges of that are like an ellipse, so it's more oval in shape. Square firing pins are squared, and then there are also cylindrical firing pins, which is a cross between some of them, so they're circular in shape, but the very tip is cut off, so it's flat. So it depends on the shape of the firing pin, but there are different geometries to the firing pins.
Okay. And would that be a class or individual characteristic, the shape of the firing pin?
The overall shape is a class characteristic, so that's something that the manufacturer decides before they even start manufacturing.
What about, are there individual characteristics as to firing pins?
Yes, there are individual characteristics observed in firing pins. Those are going to depend on the manufacturing method. So there are firing pins which are manufactured using a MIM process, that's a metal injection molding process. And those firing pins have individual characteristics from the expansion and cooling of the metal. So metal will expand when it's heated, and then when it cools, it shrinks back down. And in that process of expanding and shrinking, there are air bubbles that are formed inside of the metal itself. Those air bubbles can reach the surface of the tip of the firing pin, but when and where they reach, it's random. So the manufacturer can't really control that part. And then manufacturers, after those processes, or after the initial manufacturing process, then take those parts and polish them. And so the polishing also adds on some individual characteristics that can be observed in firing pins.
What about wear and tear and use of the firearm?
Sure, so if you're using the firearm over time, the metal in the firing pins, depending on how it was made, can become very brittle. And sometimes they can fracture, sometimes they can break, sometimes the whole tip of the firing pin will fall off, making the firearm inoperable. So depending on how much wear and tear, it can certainly cause additional individual characteristics to appear.
Is there a level of maintenance that you have to do on a firearm?
Yes.
What would
yes.
that be?
So depending on the different manufacturer, they're going to recommend a few different oiling points. But cleaning and oiling a firearm after every time it's fired is recommended by every manufacturer. And so the minimum that they recommend to do is to field strip the firearm, which means to take off the slide and the barrel, and then grease the rails that the slide sits on so that it can travel smoothly, and then also to grease the ramps that feed the cartridge into the chamber, which is part of the barrels themselves. So there are greasing points within the firearm that every manufacturer is going to recommend. They also recommend to clean the firearm, and specifically the barrel of the firearm, after each time it's fired, because every time you discharge a firearm, there's powder, there's primer residues, and there's lead from the actual discharge that can accumulate inside of that muzzle or inside of the barrel of the firearm itself. So if you don't clean that out, what can happen over time is that that buildup inside of the firearm will actually fill in the recessed areas of the barrel, and so it loses its rifling, or the rifling becomes so shallow that the accuracy of the firearm can be impacted as well.
Okay. You also mentioned that something you can look for are breech face marks. And so again, it's clear, are breech face marks ever on the projectile or bullet that goes at the front of the gun?
No, so breech face marks are only found on fire cartridge cases.
Okay. And may I approach to use your demonstrative and put on the screen so we can do it that way?
That's 24.
Sure. Yep. And so the screen in front of you is a touch screen. So could you show on here so everybody can see which are the breech face marks?
So the breech face marks, I don't know, yeah, so they extend from here, it's this entire area, and then you see some of those lines continue onto these, so that's what these scratches are, and then this area out here as well.
Okay. And what are the breech face markings caused by?
So that's actually caused by the area of the slide that the cartridge case is impacting against.
And is that an individual characteristic of the firearm or a class characteristic?
So with breech face marks, you have a combination of both. The class characteristic is the overall design. And what I mean by design is, in this case, you have lines that run parallel to each other. That parallel marking is a class characteristic. And it's characteristic of the tool that they use in order to cut that shape. In this case, it's a broach. So it's a cutting tool that they run down the face of the breech face, and it leaves these parallel lines. What's individual is the spacing between one and the other, as well as when one starts and finishes, and when and how they're oriented with each other. So those are the individual aspects of those marks. So you have a combination of both in breech face marks.
No. And so it's clear for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, when you're looking here, which is the firing pin impression?
So the firing pin impression is actually this mark right here. So it's in this particular case, it looks like a circular mark. What would be more characteristic is if this was more oblong, kind of like that. That would be characteristic of a Glock. But in this particular case, it's this circular or hemispherical shape in the middle of the primer.
And then the kind of little underneath, the little
Yeah,
hole
so
almost looking.
this little divot here is firing pin drag. So in short recoil operated firearms, which essentially just means that the firearm itself is operating using the force of the recoil. There is a locking mechanism, and different manufacturers have different locking mechanisms, but in this particular case, it's basically a cam. So before the firearm will travel, or the slide of the firearm will travel rearward, it has to cam down. When it cams down, it leaves this impression of scratches, which is from the movement of the firing pin itself, dropping down and hitting the primer during that unlocking process.
Okay. And you also mentioned extractor marks.
Mm-hmm.
Is that demonstrated on this area here?
Yes, so the extractor marks are here, and more often than not, they're not found really in this area. They just, in the manufacturer of this particular model, place them here so that we can show them more visibly. But typically, the extractors are going to be located on the side of the rim and underneath the rim. So this is more typical of the area for an extractor mark that we'd be looking for. The design of it in the firearm is essentially a hook. So it's made to catch that lip of the cartridge and then pull it out of the chamber. So usually they're not observed in the face of on the head stamp of the cartridge. They're usually observed under the rim.
So, and then you also mentioned ejector marks.
Yeah, that's this little triangular shape there. And that can vary. They're not all triangular in shape. They can be circular in shape. They can be a half moon. They can be like a semicolon. So there's different shapes that manufacturers will impart on their ejectors. The overall shape is a class characteristic. The presence or absence can be a class characteristic as well, because some firearms don't have an ejector. Some of them use the firing pin as an ejector. but there are individual marks that can be observed microscopically within the overall shape.
Speaking of microscopically, how are you looking at a projectile when it's submitted to you for analysis?
So we use a forensic comparison microscope, and all that really is two microscopes that are mounted together so that I can use one eyepiece to see both images. And that allows me to overlap the images and try to make them one, right? So if I'm looking at two different images or two different patterns, and I'm trying to see whether or not they're similar or dissimilar, if I can overlap them and then move the images back and forth, I can see if there is any agreement or not in those images. And so that's essentially how a forensic comparison microscope works.
I'm going to now show you what's been marked as states double X for identification purposes only. Do you recognize this USB?
Yes,
And did you have the opportunity to review the contents of it before you came into court today?
I did.
Did you recognize the 3 photos on that USB?
Yes,
Did they fairly and accurately depict some of the examinations you did in this case?
yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would request to move states XX in and publish to the jury.
No objection.
It'll be admitted.
States XX will be marked states 48.
So without going into the actual evidence in this case right now, can you show the ladies and gentlemen what you mean by the split screen looking at 2 things at the same time?
Right, so if you look at the image that's here, this is basically an image that I captured on a comparison microscope. And you can see the descriptors on the top portion of the image. So that's the date, the microscope I actually used, and the magnification. So this is at 22 times normal magnification. And the difference that you observe is this line here. So that line is referred to as a hairline. You can adjust the width of that hairline, so you can make it thicker, you can make it narrower. And the whole purpose of that line is so that you can split both images. By splitting both images, what it's doing is it's letting me actually see at this center point if there's any kind of continuity of the marks. And you can see in the image that you have continuity of the marks, essentially starting here and ending right around there. And that's what we're looking for, is for these marks to be continuous. And when we take a photograph, obviously it's a 2D or 2-dimensional representation of what we're seeing, captured at that moment in time. So what I can't capture is looking at this and then rotating to the next line impression and looking for agreement in that line impression, and then rotating to the next line impression, looking for agreement in that line impression. And so that repetitive agreement in the line impressions is what can allow an examiner to make a conclusion of identification or exclusion.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about rotating them.
Mhm.
How do you go about lining them up to begin with?
Yeah, so the typical orientation that you're going to use is for a right-hand twist projectile. You orient it with the nose of the projectile facing right, so that you can illuminate. All of the lights on comparison microscopes come from the rear. And so we try to use oblique lighting, which is lighting that's almost perpendicular to the surface, so that we can get the best representation of what we're looking at. So because what we're looking at is essentially raised and lowered areas, if I were to light it from directly above, you'd have a really hard time seeing any of the lines that are there. So I need to create a shadow, if you will, from behind the projectile so that I can actually observe the scratches that are on the surface of the projectile. And you have to use kind of standardized orientation, because if I were to take this projectile and line it up this way, then the shadows that I'm observing won't be the same. They'll be opposed, so they'll be opposites. So the actual spacing between the lines on one side and the other would be off. Even though they're the same projectile, I can look at it the same if I orient it correctly. When I change the orientation, then I can make them appear as if they're not the same.
Okay, so Mr. Bell, I want to follow up as well on that. How do you keep and maintain the evidence that's submitted to you separate and distinct from one another?
So when the evidence is submitted, my initial, or the initial parts of the examination really don't involve any comparison. It's really just a matter of describing the evidence that I'm receiving, which includes describing some of those class characteristics on fire casings, because manufacturers do impart that information on casings. So whether they're 40 or whether they're 9mm, whatever the caliber might be, is typically imparted right on the body of the cartridge case. And so you can read that information. And so whatever the manufacturer is and the caliber are listed as part of the descriptor of that item. And then the items each, as I'm describing them, are assigned an individual and unique exhibit number by our information management system.
Okay. You talked about caliber. I don't think we've defined that yet for our ladies and gentlemen of the jury. What is the caliber of a cartridge?
So for firearms examiners, caliber has two different definitions. The primary definition of caliber is actually referring to the diameter of the base of a bullet. And so that's where the actual word caliber comes from, is really just a measurement of the diameter of the base. However, that has to correspond to the cartridge case, because the diameter of this base has to be able to fit into the mouth of the cartridge case. So when they do translate that, the manufacturers will stamp a caliber on the head stamp area of the cartridge. And so the caliber for the cartridge means that the specific designation that the manufacturer put on it, which will hold the caliber of projectile. So it's a designation that the manufacturer gives the live cartridge as far as the caliber is concerned.
And how does a caliber translate over to a firearm?
So firearms are typically designed to fire a particular caliber. Some firearms have interchangeability. So I think the most common interchangeability is that a 38 special cartridge can be shot in a 357 Magnum caliber firearm. We also have several different ones in rifles and whatnot. But if this cartridge is a 9mm and you have a 40 Smith & Wesson caliber firearm, then this cartridge was not designed to be fired in that firearm, and vice versa. That firearm was not designed to fire a 9mm. So firearms are designed to fire a particular caliber, kind of regardless as to the interchangeability of calibers. They're designed by the manufacturer to fire a particular caliber.
With regards to, you said the 357 and the 38 special
Mhm.
can kind of be used both ways. Is there characteristics and things that you would be able to tell if the wrong size caliber projectile was put through the wrong size, a different size caliber firearm?
Depending on the actual calibers involved, yes. So like a 357 and a 38, the reason they're interchangeable is because the bullet itself and the cartridge case itself are actually very, very similar. And the way that those firearms are manufactured, they're rimmed firearms, and so they don't chamber based on the cartridge itself, they chamber based on the rim. And so as long as you have a rim that's the same size, you can load a rim that's the same size and a projectile that's the same size. You can load anything into that firearm and it will shoot. When it comes to semi-automatic firearms, so that's really, that caliber is mainly a revolver caliber.
Okay.
When it comes to semi-automatic firearms, the function is much more complex than a revolver in design. And so most semi-automatic firearms will chamber based on the front of the cartridge. So this little space that's between the projectile itself and the cartridge is where the firearm will catch the cartridge and not let it keep going into the barrel itself. And so if there's any difference, so if this cartridge is too narrow for the firearm, it can slip through and fall right out of the barrel. If it's wide enough that it can catch that lip and not fall in, but not wide enough so that the whole chamber is supporting the cartridge itself, when it fires, what will happen is the body of the cartridge will actually expand to fill any space that was remaining inside that chamber. So when we get that cartridge into the laboratory, it won't be a smoothly, a kind of rounded cartridge. It'll have an oblong side to it. And that's indicative that it was fired in what we call subcaliber. So it's a smaller caliber fired in a larger caliber firearm, And the same thing happens to the projectile, because if the projectile is not snugly fit into the barrel, it'll dance moving down the barrel itself. And so these rifling impressions that are fairly consistent throughout the length of the projectile won't be consistent at all. You'll have those skipping marks, and the rotation of it will also be inconsistent with the rifling, so you can have rifling patterns that overlap. And those characteristics would indicate that it was fired in a smaller caliber, again, a smaller caliber projectile in a larger caliber firearm. The reverse really can't happen, right? So if you have a larger caliber cartridge, let's say a 45, you can't shoot a 45 in a 40, you can't shoot a 40 in a 9, because they don't fit at all into the firearm. So it has to be a smaller cartridge into a larger caliber firearm.
Okay. So in terms of you have a projectile and you have a casing. Can you ever marry those two together?
So there are rare chances where that can happen. Typically it's from firearms that don't mark very well. So what ends up happening is that when the projectile exits the cartridge, it'll actually pick up marks from the inside of the cartridge itself. And so there are times where you can marry the marks from the inside of this cartridge to a projectile. However, it's very rare, because once the projectile travels through the barrel, it picks up marks from the barrel. So the marks that were left on it by the cartridge case are essentially erased by the barrel itself. So it's very difficult and very rare that we're able to actually examine projectiles and compare them to a cartridge case. The more common occurrence is that you have a firearm submitted, which I can then use to produce known test fires and shoot one live cartridge, which will give me a projectile and a cartridge, and then I can compare them, those pieces of evidence or pieces of known evidence, to my unknowns and say they were fired in the same firearm at that point. But in the absence of a firearm, that's not an examination that can typically be done.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what is NIBIN.
Mhm.
What does that stand for?
So NIBIN is a National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. Essentially what it is, it's a computer database that examiners can use to capture images of spent cartridge cases. So essentially we're just capturing this image there and uploading that to the database. The database then will run an algorithm on the shadows observed. So that's a printout of what the images are that are acquired. And it'll run an algorithm based on the shadows observed, so the lights and the dark areas on the images. And it essentially sends back a list of cartridge cases that are ranked the highest as having possibly been fired in the same firearm. That doesn't mean they were, right? So every time we run a search in NIBIN, we get results back. Whether or not they were actually fired in the same firearm is up to the examiners to determine. So there is a correlation score that it gives, which is the number that's based on these algorithms of agreement. Now, that score is really just based on the search that it's running. So the score is not one of those types of scores where, oh, if it's a 9, I know for sure that it was fired in the same firearm, or if it's a 4, I know it wasn't. There's really not that kind of cutoff because it's based on the results of the list. So we have to look at the results every time we do a search in NIBIN. And we're looking for those same characteristics. So we're trying to do the same exact thing we do on the microscope. We try to do that using NIBIN to determine whether or not those images have enough agreement to say that they were fired in the same firearm. And then if they were, then we would report out a lead. And a lead essentially is just investigative information for detectives to say, hey, look, these cases are potentially associated. If you're gonna do any further investigation, please let us know. We'll compare the fired evidence in the case on the microscope and confirm whether or not this association was a valid association.
Would you ever testify to a NIBIN match?
So typically that's not something that we testify to. Anything we're testifying to is something that we have physically compared on the microscope.
Why is it important to physically compare them on the microscope right there in front of you?
So the main reason we would do that is to actually have the evidence in front of us. The NIBIN computer database is based on images that were acquired by people, and all of us are flawed people, right? We all make mistakes. And in order to curtail those mistakes, we have these safety checks in place. NIBIN doesn't have those safety checks, and so an outside agency may have acquired this image saying it was involved in this particular case, but then when I ask for the evidence back, it's a different image. So that kind of examiner error doesn't usually have a way to be caught, or can have a way to kind of get slipped through the systems, depending on the laboratory. And so per our own operating procedures and most laboratories' procedures, we cannot testify to somebody else's work. Right? So I cannot say who put in this other information, that the information they put in is accurate. And so in order to say, well, I know what the information is, I need to have the physical evidence in front of me so that I can see the images and I can actually see the evidence under the microscope and know for a fact this exhibit came from this cartridge case, it has chain of custody, and I can verify that they are or were not fired in the same firearm.
In terms of the projectiles, are they ever put into NIBIN?
So most laboratories don't have a system to capture projectiles into the database. There are a handful of laboratories that do. Really, the ATF is the one that kind of has guidance and maintenance over NIBIN. And so what they recommend laboratories to use is the brass tracks, or the portion of the database that will capture images of casings. Their primary reason for that is that even casing, so every time I want to take a picture of these cartridge cases, it takes about 12 minutes. So that means that for every casing that I'm putting in, I'm using 12 minutes of time. If I were to catch the projectiles, even if it's a perfect projectile, where, something like this, where it's an exemplar, it's going to take me about 12 minutes per land impression. So it might take me 45 minutes or an hour to capture one projectile. And so what they found was that even though it's a tool that's out there, the cost of the tool and the time to use that tool isn't worth the difference that you're going to get from capturing casings. Because most cases have casings that are left at a crime scene and projectiles. So the case where you have just projectiles from a scene, it's not very common.
Okay, so going on to the projectiles, talking about those, do they have a specific composition or things that they're made of?
So different manufacturers for cartridge cases and for live ammunition will use different projectiles. So projectiles can be made for different functions, and they can be made out of different materials. So the most common material, and the reason that this model is copper colored, is because most jacketing is copper. So that's the most common material that you're going to find as far as bullet jackets. They can be designed just like this, where it's a full metal jacket. Typically in a full metal jacket, it's a rounded or flat nose, and the base of the projectile itself is left open, and so this area here is where the lead of the projectile is actually found. There are manufacturers that make what they call a total metal jacket. A total metal jacket means that the entire lead core is encased in a copper jacket. There are also steel jackets, and so the jacket itself might have a copper color, but it's steel, not copper. Steel is magnetic, copper is not. That's how you would distinguish those two. There are manufacturers that use nickel jackets, and now they're kind of coming out with, kind of you name it. There are manufacturers that have jackets that are solely made out of copper. There are manufacturers who have kind of projectiles that are very, very weird, not necessarily your standard kind of projectile. So it's one of those things where they can design them to do a lot of different things, the projectiles. And so that, depending on its function and its intended design, you might have different designs of the projectile itself.
So you indicated the jacket. What about the interior, you said the lead core? Is that standard throughout the industry?
The lead core is fairly standard. The only time you're not going to have a lead core is if it is a lead-free ammunition. There was a big push years ago to try to make hunting rounds lead-free. And so that ammunition, if you can still find it, is lead-free in the sense that the copper is still there, but the inside is made of other materials. It might be zinc, it might be different, heavy metals that can give a weight similar to lead, but not be lead.
Okay.
City Council, it's a good time to take a break. I'm being told we need a restroom break.
Yes, sir.
All right? All right, so ladies and gentlemen, Remember the admonition, do not discuss the case, don't form any opinion about the case, don't allow anyone to discuss the case in your presence, and certainly no research, just leave your notepads on your chairs, and we'll be back with you shortly. All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Let the record reflect that you jury stepped out. Counsel made along with the defendant. Does he need a restroom break, Mr. Dennis? Yes. You arranged a restroom break for Mr. Dennis? Anything to discuss, counsel? No. All right, we're in recess. Thank you.
All right, Pico, how we doing? The stream coming good? What's the chat saying? Are they saying they can hear me? Chat, can you guys hear me? We might be lagging, Pico, because we're just trying to set this up for the first time. I hear you loud and clear. Chat, tell us how we're doing. Oh, maybe I should get on the Wi-Fi. Let me try to get on the Wi-Fi. Still lagging. Yeah, I hear you and I see you. I just don't know what the feed looks like, whether the chat can hear me. All right, so let's cut it. Just cut it and put the standby sign on.